The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly read-along podcast for Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time saga, starting, of course, with book one, The Eye of the World. I am your host, Greg, the person who still, despite reading now 300 pages, knows very little about the Wheel of Time books. And I am joined, as always, by our resident expert, the Wheel of Time himself personified. It is Tylor. Tylor, how are you today?
I am doing very well, Greg, and I'm excited for these next couple chapters because we've been kind of lacking action for a while, and we do not lack action in these two chapters. So we've got a lot to kind of dig into, a lot to figure out where things are going. And we actually want to begin today by talking about the chapter icon. We are doing yet another one of our ill-advised discussions of something visual on our completely non-visual podcast. And you had kind of hyped up last time wanting to talk about the chapter icon at the beginning of chapter 18, the Caemlyn Road. And before I say anything about it, I want to hear what you think this image is, what you think it proceeds in chapters. What do you think when you see this image, now having read a grand total of one chapter with this image on the head of it?
So just to describe it for anybody not looking at it, or for our dear friends who may be audiobook consumers, this is a triptych. So 3 panels. The center panel is a skull that is, human-esque, but decidedly not human. And it has 2 appear to be horns that extend, out over the other 2 panels of the triptych. Then to the left of the skull, the panel is a trident-like pitchfork type thing, stylized. And then in the right one, there is a hand, which is clenched in a fist, almost like a power sign or something like that, but appears to be either scaled or armored in what appears here. So, I think it immediately evokes to me something devilish, right? That something of the darkness. And so my mind jumps to Dark One. It jumps to, some of the various creatures we've seen before. But of course, as you just alluded to, this is the first chapter we're seeing it. And we've had Trollocs before, and the shadow creatures whose name I'm forgetting, because I still don't know anything.
Murdrill or Fades.
And so I'm guessing it's neither of those. And then I would note, this is done as other ones are, like it's a woodcut. So it's kind of 2 tones. And while some of this might just be for definition, I think it's kind of striking that the trident has each of the forks is split between white and black. And so again, in a book where we're thinking so much about this dichotomy and this division, it's really interesting that that is how they choose to portray that, because it could be more simple, a white outline, a black outline on the opposite cover. And that's all I got.
So I am here to confirm a couple of things that you just said as being accurate or more or less accurate. The centerpiece of the triptych, I believe, is supposed to appear to be the skull of a Trolloc, right? It has horns like many of them do. It's kind of human-esque, but has kind of bestial features. The 2 on the side, we have actually had very brief reference to earlier on in a much earlier chapter. In chapter 7, when we first see Lan after Winter Night, Moraine is like resting and recovering from doing a bunch of magic, and Lan is going through a number of Trolloc bodies, and he pulls out a few what look like badges made of metal. And one of them is described in the book. He says the word Cobal, and then sees it is the trident symbol goes with the Cobal. We also see described, but it's not yet associated with the specific tribe. The fist is one of the other badges that he pulls out from those Trollocs. So generally speaking, this is the symbol for here there be Trollocs, or at the least here there be shadow creatures of some kind. Sometimes like a Murdrail chapter will have this symbol. Every once in a while you'll get, we've had why can't I think of the flying ones off the top of my head? Dragcar. Sometimes they will also get this symbol as well, but generally it's creatures of the shadow are what are preceded by this image.
And, kind of a quick take on it too is that because it's so evocative of skulls, and it's almost like a Dia de la Morte, Lost Morte image, it does feel kind of ghoulish to start a chapter that way. Like, oh, we're going to be going, well, like you said, there be Trollocs here, or there be darkness here, as we kind of move into the chapter for it. So I like that one. And I will say, as I moved my bookmark to be ready to name the chapters at the end of this episode, I noticed the next chapter also has this symbol, the one after this episode. So yes. So I will not talk about that anymore, but I think we should turn our discussion to our two chapters for tonight. So we are reading, or hopefully we have read for this episode, chapter 18 and chapter 19. Chapter 18 is called The Caemlyn Road, and chapter 19 is called Shadows Waiting. Before you go to your summary, I will say I read these chapters, and I immediately texted Tyler the gif of Ron Burgundy saying, well, that escalated quickly. So that's my mood as we go into these chapters. Over to you.
So we are definitely getting into chapters that, with a little bit more plot in them, I find much more difficult to summarize succinctly, but much more easy to pull out the few things that we're going to end up talking about. So forgive me if this gets long. The chapter begins basically with Rand remembering a bunch of the maps that he's seen around town, and basically tracing out where they are relative to the hills of Abshur and Whitebridge and a number of other places nearby. This becomes really important very quickly because the Trollocs start sounding their horns, and very quickly it becomes clear that not only are they closing in on them from the west, but also there is a band of Trollocs to their east as well. We get a number of kind of chasing scenes that, I'll be honest, blend together quite a bit, but we do get some very interesting character notes as we start to go into kind of the first battle that we've really seen in the Wheel of Time. We get the battle cries that are given out by a number of characters, where Rand and Perrin cry out for Manetheren. Matt gives a cry in some other language that isn't entirely comprehensible to the reader. And we also hear Lan multiple times in this chapter referenced in relation to the Seven Towers. And so we get some new hints as far as what's going on with Lan. During the battle, we see Lan battling a Fade. We see Rand fighting off a number of Trollocs who are trying to pull him off of a horse. And most interestingly, we finally get to see kind of the extent of Moraine's power in combat, as she lights a number of Trollocs on fire, and many of them are basically fleeing from her. Once Lan cuts off the head of the Fade, all of the Trollocs basically collapse on the ground. It turns out that Matt had fallen on the ground, but everyone else was all right. We get what I think is actually a really interesting description from Rand as far as what it feels like to be in battle, and I think that might be something that I'd be interested to come back to later on. And then we get the fleeing after the battle, where Moraine creates earthquakes and a wall of flame, and that buys them enough time to get to what they soon realize is an abandoned city, Hall, which we'll learn much more about in the following chapter. So, Greg, a lot happened there, but it's all, like we said, very plot forward and maybe a little bit less kind of character oriented than some of the chapters we've had so far. So I'm curious what kind of stuck with you among all of the many things that are going on in the chapter.
Yeah. So my first note is just to say I don't know if this is that great a discussion point, but I did like that Rand was looking at his map and they took the time to describe a lot of that. That was very helpful to me and was a moment where I did my own check-in. So I flipped back to the front of the book and could kind of see a lot of what was being described. And perhaps more than any chapter so far, I found myself flipping back because they're covering ground and they're making decisions about which direction to head at different moments in this chapter. And so I found myself like, oh, okay, so if that's a hillside, they're going this way, that way, and so on. So maybe in passing, I'll note that was really helpful. I did find a lot of this the kind of thing my eyes glaze over a little, right? And that is not
Yeah.
a Robert Jordan thing. That's a common complaint some people have, my wife being one of them, about like modern Marvel movies is like two people punching and then you just somebody win already.
Yeah.
And I found myself kind of doing that. Like I wanted to know the outcome because I care about these characters, but the descriptions of like he slashes this way and he punches that way aren't the most thrilling thing to read, and or at least not for me, not what I'm interested in as much. That being said, I thought the character beats you just pulled out in your description were the most exciting thing to me. And so I'm sure you want to talk about them all in turn. Maybe start. I think Lan is the first to let his out, and he says he's the last Lord of the Seven Towers. Uh, Ooh, I mean, again, a very short, simple phrase that implies so much about this world and where they're all coming from. Not just Lord of the Seven Towers, but last Lord of the
Last Lord. Yeah.
Seven Towers. Now, prior to this chapter, I had seen him so much in the role of a squire, right? Of somebody who just supports the knight or supports the real hero. And this recasts that for me a little bit, that he seems to have his own kind of prestige or his own kind of presence in an intriguing way, which then makes me want to know, well, how did these two hook up together then? Not literally hooking up, but like how did they become partners together? So yeah, I'm sure there's things you can't tell, but what would you say about that?
So let me ask you this, and this is a broad question. I have a very intriguing answer for you, but it involves spoiling the cover of a book that you would definitely see at your average bookstore, but you may not have seen.
Let's do it. I think it's fine.
Okay.
I think that's a fine level of spoiler. Do not worry about it.
The prequel is about exactly what you just said. The prequel book, the cover of it is Lan and Moraine more or less meeting, if not for the first time, early on in their days of knowing one another. So that is a story that you will get in 9 books. Welcome to the Wheel of Time.
And remind me, the prequel book, you said people were anxious for him to get to the end, and he paused and did a prequel book late in the series.
Correct. It was between books 10 and 11, and book 11 ended up being the last that he was able to write on his own.
And so, like on the back of my paperback, I have the list of numbered books, but that doesn't make the list, or does it?
In some editions, it's at the very end, like after 14, it takes the place of like 15. In some, it's between 10 and 11, and some it's at the beginning, or it just hates that book for some reason.
Yeah, my list happens to have 14 total.
Interesting.
So I'm assuming it didn't make the cut for this one. And again, mine is just for the listeners, mine's just a generic mass market paperback. It was literally the cheapest one because if I only read a chapter and wanted to bail on Tylor, I was going to without much regret. But I haven't yet. So okay, so that's good to know. I mean, again, a promise of far, far down the line. But good to know there's a story there. And there's a piece of me that always is curious now, ever since the episode, which I think everybody just heard recently as we were recording this, where you explained that a lot of the mythology could be read as like our world in the past. There was the Neil Armstrong thing.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, so 7 towers, what would those be in our world? Or is that just a more of a fantasy thing? I kind of take all those kind of hypothesizing or questioning moments for myself as like, well, it could be something, or it could be the hundreds of years rather between then and now. So it could be totally different or what have you. I mean, you are always ranting on street corners about the New World Order and how we should be divided into 7 equal distant zones. So it must be no.
As it turns out, if you're going to go down a really crazy wheel of time, what does that number mean rabbit hole? 7 is the correct one to do. But we don't have enough information to really dive too much into 7. I actually wanted to pull out something kind of related to what you were just saying. We were talking about, the 7 towers, and unfortunately, that's the only detail we get here, right? Lan is as closed-mouthed as always, but we do get that. It then plays into the next kind of character beats we get are the shouts, the battle cries by the Two Rivers boys. And so I'm curious what you kind of keyed in on. Were you surprised that it was Matt who was the one who pulled out some other language? Were you surprised about who was shouting? What jumped out at you as that scene kind of first time you read it?
That what struck me the most is that it just came kind of out of from outside of them, right? That this was almost like a possession or some kind of, force that is acting upon them. I wouldn't say against their will, but essentially without their consent. Like it just comes from the outside and it flows through them. So I don't even think I hit that level of, oh, it's Matt, as much as I was just like, oh, the rules of this world are a little different than I thought they were. That the fact that you possess old blood could be so important in this world that it can essentially take you over, that there's some kind of power it has over you. Now, there was also a side that's like, well, it's like teenagers. And like, if my friends and I ran down a hill when I was 13, I might yell out something stupid I, heard in a movie once. I remember playing with my cousin once. Everything we were doing, he wanted to name our snow fort Fort Brigadoon. And I was like, why? What is that? And he's like, I don't know. I heard it. It's awesome though. Brigadoon. I'm like, is it like what? So anyway, so it's kind of like it could be that kind of thing too. Like these boys are saying, oh, it's not from me, or it's kind of like cultural knowledge they have from where they're from. Now, Moraine is the one who signals to us. And again, despite all the advice, I trust Moraine, that, it is actually, it's meaningful. It's not just idle shouts. And that's pretty interesting and pretty cool.
Yeah, and to me, what's really interesting here is this is our first real glimpse at how each of these boys potentially has something of their own that makes them unique and different, right? So far, we've kind of just lumped it's the 3 boys and then the one who seems different in and of himself, who has been Rand, right? Rand is a different color hair, Rand has different colored eyes, he's taller, he has all of the unique features. And then suddenly Matt's the one who jumps out as having something different. And we see in the next chapter how lots of characters react a little bit differently to him, kind of thinking like, oh, is it you who's the real one of the 3 of us? And I think that's something that we're going to keep seeing over and over again, is no matter how much at any point we're just going to jump to Rand is the person, he's the only one whose head we're in. The further down the line we get, the more we get kind of interesting moments like Egwene immediately being able to channel, or Matt having, this out of body experience even more so than the other 2. And so to think of the old blood and the one power and whatever else is out there, we're sort of starting to pile up a large number of powers in only 300 pages or so.
Yeah, it actually kind of feels like an RPG, right? That like, oh, we're gaining powers, and oh, well, yeah, we were all unremarkable, but now I'm headed down this skill tree and you're headed down that skill tree. And I know the timing of that, this would obviously be capable of being influenced by tabletop and tabletop culture, although pretty early in that regard. So okay, yeah, and that also makes me think it stands out a little different from some of the other fantasy comparisons we've made. While Merry, Pippin, and Sam go on to have their own adventures in Lord of the Rings, they are not marked as different or remarkable. Although I guess Frodo isn't necessarily either. But to make sure that like, oh, we need to track all these, that also, just the way you described it, makes me feel like they're not going to stay together, right? That we're gonna break up and we're gonna go in different directions, and maybe each has to explore that deeper part of themselves.
Yeah, and I think that kind of leads me very nicely, unless you had anything else to say about the battle cries, into the actual battle itself, right? And as you said, I'm kind of with you. My eyes tend to glaze over very quickly when I'm watching movie fights, and they glaze over even faster when I'm reading battles. This is why, for a long time, people would ask me, like, which is better, the TV show Game of Thrones or the books? And my answer was always, well, what you want to do is you want to watch the show first and then read the books. Because in something that's so built around shocks, the fact that it can go immediately and, oops, there's the red wedding, or oops, there's, other crazy event. I don't want to spoil too many things. um, that works better on television. I feel the same way about battles and this scene in particular, right? I think this could be a really interesting, fun 1.5, 2-minute, well choreographed Amazon Prime scene. I don't need 3 pages of it, even though that's a brief fantasy battle, right? But I will say, I think the way it's described lends really well to the description we get right after of Rand talking about what he remembers from the battle and the heat and how it felt like discrete moments and suddenly it was over. He couldn't really gauge time during it. And that, I think, both kind of rings true to the way that it's written earlier. I think it is kind of very breathless in a way that works. But I think there's also something really interesting to the fact that Rand is kind of immediately dwelling on what is it like to be in battle? What is it like to be a soldier? How do you get through that? And that's really interesting as kind of a meditation in a fantasy novel like this. And I think part of it, I'm sure, is the fact that Robert Jordan did serve 2 tours in Vietnam, right? So he has a very particular perspective on what battle looks and feels like.
Yeah, as somebody who's been in a lot of battles myself, no, I think that is appealing to as an experience for readers, right? Because fantasy, especially as a genre about escapism, and that you want to just
Yeah.
get out of your world. And there are a lot of story scholars who discuss how actually bizarre it is that humans need conflict in their stories. I'm putting it in very broad terms
Yeah.
there, but essentially, why, if you're escaping into a piece of art, isn't it just like pure fantasy, right? Like,
Yeah.
but if it's like the kid gets $1 million and buys all the toys and plays with them, we check out of that story. Like, that's boring to us, like actual wish fulfillment escapism. And so I think when you're describing there the subjective experience of Rand within the battle, that is to me a good kind of escapism, because that's what we're looking to do, to kind of place ourselves in those stirrups and holding that sword and kind of imagine what it is and how we'd react to it. And in that way, to me, when you're talking about how it's like flashes of moments, that that also feels cinematic. I've experienced
Yeah.
movies like that where it's like, oh, this kind of quick montage sums up an hour of battle or what have you, because that's what we need to understand it a bit. Now, Rand, particularly being drawn to it, is he some kind of chosen one who's meant to be a warrior? Is he remembering? Is that how the old blood manifests in him? Like, it seems to me there's a lot of potential there that this is something. He's on the warrior skill tree. In other words, that's his direction, perhaps, in this story.
Yeah, and to me, just the way that we get brief glimpses of all of the other characters, but we get to just briefly see how each of them responds in, a moment of panic or a moment of battle. I think it's a pretty effective scene, even though for both of us, we do kind of our eyes glaze over just a little bit. That pretty much leads me to the end of the chapter as far as things that I had in my notes to really bring up. Was there anything else that you wanted to make sure we mentioned about the Caemlyn Road?
I would say I have just 2 other quick things, not deep discussions. One, I really did enjoy how Moraine's powers were described, the way she uses her magic, and there's both like a cleverness to it, but also a sheer power to it, like just brute force about
Yeah.
something like earthquakes and fires. Um, and that was really exciting and fun to think about it. I had visions of Gandalf and the Balrog, right? And
Yeah.
things like that. I mean, it was obviously a horde and not one giant monster. And then that actually leads into my second point, which was I did get a little worried about like they're facing like 500 at once. Like
Yeah.
they escalated so quickly from like, we're worried about this group of 10, and it's not like it's 50 now, it's 500.
Yeah.
And the way that escalated so quickly then made the battle feel like, well, was that too easy? Was it a little like, I get it. These are the faceless horde in the video game that you just get to mow down on your way to a boss and
Yeah.
practice your cool combos and level up. But it was all of a sudden like, okay, there's what we're at 9 now, 10 of them
Yeah.
versus 500, and we all come through unscathed. That was hurting my kind of credulity, I guess would be a better word for it. So I did have that kind of reaction, but I will note that Moraine was, winded by the experience. It's not
Yeah.
like she can keep that up for hours and hours. It took a lot out of her, and she had to immediately kind of head into a rest cycle.
Yeah,
Um,
I read this battle as like that moment in every video game where your like level 2 characters suddenly join up with two like level 15 characters who suddenly proceed to murder your way through the battle. And then they're like, don't worry, guys, we'll guard the door, right? Like that's Lan and Moraine right now. Just like, okay, we're guiding you through this, right? You can each take on 2 Trollocs. We're gonna kill 100 each. It'll be fine. But I think what this really does is it highlights just how screwed these characters would be if it weren't for Moraine and Lan, right? Imagine if those 2 characters hadn't been in the 2 rivers when they were. It's over, right? Completely,
yeah.
right? That's kind of the scope that I think we're getting here, is just how much further above the 2 rivers folk Moraine and Lan are, right? I think the initial read is like, oh, this is like Aragorn, they're like level 3 characters in Dungeons and Dragons land. And I think we're now kind of going like, oh no, they're Gandalf, they're big.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think of all the funny video games where there's like a massive battle going on around you, but
Yeah.
you're just like on the other side of a fence from it and just have to run to a door or something, like you were alluding to. But yeah, at the same time, it's like it's not like it's 500 versus 500 and you're moving through this. It's just 500 versus 2 as you move through it. So I guess where I land on that, a little cynical take, it's like, you get this one, Robert Jordan, but if this is what it is all the time, again, I like these characters. You got to start hurting people, you got to start killing people, or else it feels like they're invincible, and that's
for sure.
A problem. All right, so we have started down the Caemlyn Road. Why don't you take us into Shadows Waiting, chapter 19?
Yes, so they arrive in the city of Aridhall, and we get this great description of just how enormous the city and the buildings feel, even compared to Barelon, right? We're only 2 or 3 chapters removed from these characters thinking of that kind of like minor dinky city as being something magnificent, and now they really see how wrong they truly were. The boys are left to tend the horses. This is the worst decision anyone has ever made. Immediately, Matt is, convincing everybody, we gotta go. They said there won't be any Trollocs. It's going to be totally safe. Don't worry about it at all. He's very wrong. Matt's a rube, as you put it in a previous episode. That seems to be the theme. They walk around for a while. Nothing really seems to stand out. Everything seems empty. And then a man walks out from some shadows, introduces himself as Mordeth, and offers to have them go into a basement. And if they can help him carry some treasure out to his horses, he'll let them keep whatever else of the treasure they want to carry away. Matt obviously is thrilled, but immediately upon hearing the words Tar Valon, Mordeth starts to swell. Rand realizes that he doesn't have a shadow, and he basically blows up like a balloon, yelling about everyone dying. The boys run away. They arrive back to a very upset Nynaeve and Moraine, and then Moraine tells them the history of Aridhall and how it became the city of Shadar Lagoth. And that city revolves around an individual named Mordeth, who supposedly lived thousands of years ago. The chapter ends with Lan arriving and saying there have been Fades and Trollocs forced into the city. Normally, I wouldn't worry about them at all. They're basically too afraid to find anything, but they're headed directly for us. And that is how we get the Trolloc symbol at the beginning of the next chapter that we are going to be reading. So what jumped out to you in Shadows Waiting? Because it's another one of those chapters Robert Jordan sometimes does where it kind of jumps between two big events that are related, but not necessarily tied to each other in terms of plot.
My primary reaction to this chapter was that it felt very much like a kind of like road encounter that's common to mythology, right? Like you are walking past a pond and a frog comes out talking to you and you have to pass his test, and so it felt like that, right? And again, we talk about the second quarter of Joseph Campbell's cycle as the Road of Trials, and this is another test. And how foolish and dumb can you be, and maybe just not quite enough that you get caught, you continue on and you learn that piece of wisdom not to do all of that. So it felt very familiar in structure in that way, like a test and then they passed the test, but within that there were a few interesting pieces of it. It didn't make your summary, but I will say what struck me the most about the very opening of the chapter is that Moraine seemed to validate Nynaeve, right? By saying like, oh, gather some of your herbs, help me with some of that. And that to me was a very surprising moment because that was not the dynamic I had thought was between them. And it was good to know, again, like, yeah, I respect what you can do. It's not on the same level as me, but it is of utility to this group. And she brings something to the fellowship, if you will. And then there is a little bit more of Matt reflecting on the battle cry and how he's kind of bothered by that. But I think we covered that enough last time. But just to note, it did stick with him a little bit. And when you call a character a rube, you don't think things stick with them that much. And so that to me was like a road sign that like, okay, this is actually something that's going to keep being a part of this character's journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if we're jumping kind of on Matt's journey, I think we need to at least talk a little bit about just how excited this man is about treasure, about finding something unique and different. He's an explorer. And then we get his reaction. I think in this chapter, he finds at the top of the pile of treasure the dagger with the ruby on the hilt, right? And his reaction to that is to just immediately like snatch it and grab it and it's mine. So how do we reconcile, or how did you reconcile that kind of new recognition of Matt's kind of depth and the way that he thinks about and dwells on things, but simultaneously seeing a little bit more of that, childish, like, I see it, I want it, it's mine kind of attitude towards all of the things going on in Arid Hall?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the childish side fits with the kind of trickster craziness he'd been up to previously, that kind of immaturity. I actually thought a lot in that sequence about the Disney film Aladdin, right? And it's like, go in and just get the lamp. I mean, there was no kind of lamp here for that, but there was this sense that like, oh, all of this treasure is trouble. And, Matt seems to be tempted to like load his pockets. I think they check with him afterwards, like multiple times, like there's nothing in your pockets, right? Like we're not worried about that. And so some of that was really interesting to me. And this is going way back, I think, to the first couple of chapters where Moraine gave them each a piece of gold to like seal their contract.
Yeah,
right?
Silver piece.
Silver piece. And so there's clearly some rules in this world about when you make, I don't know, I would call it a covenant, even though I'm not a religious guy, but when you make a covenant or a contract or a pact, and then you seal that with some kind of exchange. And so much of the fear around Matt grabbing the ruby dagger or something like that is just that he may have stumbled backwards into some kind of contract with Mordeth, and then that's reinforced by the fact that it was a contract with Mordeth that caused the downfall of the city, essentially, if I'm reading that right.
That is correct. I do just want to draw your attention to one wonderful kind of event in the chain that you're describing. When Moraine asks, she asks all of the boys, like, did Mordeth touch you? Did he whatever? She goes through all of those questions. And the last question that she asks Matt, did he give you anything? And or no, she says, did you take anything of his? And Matt's response is, he didn't give us anything.
A lie of omission, one would
Yeah,
assume.
just
Yeah.
be ready for that. It's Matt. He's still a bit of a rube.
Well, I also meant to say, I was going to say this when you were doing your larger description of the chapter. I read these chapters coincidentally. I went out to the movie The Black Phone, which is a horror movie in theaters right now about like kids getting napped by this guy who is kind of freaky. It's Ethan Hawke in the movie.
Yeah.
And so like that kind of sinister type of tension just like totally penetrated me. And so I'm reading this, I'm like, it's Ethan Hawke. Like, don't follow him. Don't help him pick up his groceries. Like, just get away. Interestingly, about More Death, I thought was the fact that it was the lie that really seemed to set him off. The fact that they had been less than truthful or less than upfront with him really set him off. And as you noted in your summary, that did also involve Tar Valon. So like a major power is involved in this. But it felt to me like the lie was more important to him, which, again, thinking of this as the kind of encounter where a hero is supposed to learn something, it's like, well, we've been taught we should lie our way out through this situation to protect the safety of the group. But now we're seeing that that's the kind of thing that sets off a villain within that. The blowing up like a balloon, I had trouble like picturing. It didn't really work
I always
for
have
me.
too.
So I'd be interested if the show tackles that encounter, what exactly they did, because it sounded too cartoony to me. But again, that's more a failure of my imagination. But let's see. And then the last thing I will say kind of in my notes related to that, or yeah, you go.
If I can actually jump in, one thing that you had just, talked about a minute ago was the lie that kind of sets Mordeth off. Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting to know now that we have the context. The first time you read it, you don't catch it. But now that we have the context that Mordeth is potentially someone who is either a ghost or is thousands of years old or is the rebirth of someone who was Mordeth or whatever is going on with this situation, we know he's old, right? Notice he recognized the name Tar Valon, but he admits in the same sentence he didn't recognize Caemlyn, which is one of the largest cities in the world in the modern era. So it's not just that they're lying, although I think that definitely is a big part of the distrust, is literally the word that Moraine uses over and over again when describing Shadar Logoth. But I think there's also something here to the fact that he literally just thought like, oh, they're going to like a bumpkin town, when really he's just from 2000 years ago. Caemlyn wasn't a thing back then.
Well, and again, you allude to this in your summary, the fact that this is a massive city by comparison, and the architecture description takes up a lot of the opening, but that it is a fallen city. Again, this kind of deep history the world has continues to intrigue me as a reader. Here everything's dusty and abandoned, and it's kind of simple to picture that, but to remind yourself of the scale he's talking about here is difficult, because it's easy to think of this as like a block of ruined buildings, but he's describing something really big within that. So that's a little shocking. And then, of course, the 1,000 years helps to answer that, right? Like this is a world with deep recorded history or partially recorded history. So all that plays a role here. I think it was interesting that when they returned to Moraine, she was clearly planning on all this. She again was ahead of this game. She just didn't know the boys would walk out of her protections. But she says, I cast wards, I cast powerful protections. It's another kind of entry in her power set that I don't think had been really truly revealed yet. I mean, maybe she's used it before, but hasn't spoken of it. And the fact that she can create kind of a protected area from spirits of a certain kind, but it's not like she's like, so don't worry about the Trollocs coming, we're good. Like, she's still worried. So we do have different powers affecting different segments of this universe, of this realm.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting to me about this is how quick. So two things jump out to me about this. One is how quickly Moraine was able to put this plan into place after being just completely devastated from, making an earthquake and a wall of fire and all of those crazy, what I think of in Dungeons and Dragons speak as high level spells, right?
Mm.
How quickly she's able to recover. And I think that speaks both to kind of how powerful whatever being an Aes Sedai does to you is, but also potentially we were just talking about her saying, Nynaeve, you're going to be really important. Well, this is the sign that her herbs are working exactly as it was intended. The other thing that I think is really interesting here is what you pointed out is just how on top of things she is, right? It's not just that she has the ability to set out a ward against these sorts of spirits, that she had the plan with Lan, put me to sleep for an hour. I need the herbs that will let me wake up, and then I can do the ward once I'm ready enough. She, is very kind of in control of everything. And I think that's, to me, why it was so surprising to see her leaning a little bit on Nynaeve's skill set, because so far she has been so kind of self-assured and in control. And if she can solve a problem, she's going to be the one solving the problem.
Well, and just to expand on all that this is obviously not plan A either, right?
Right.
Like last chapter derailed plan A. So then this was the backup plan. And yet she still remains able to kind of plan out this pathway or just to improvise really effectively.
Yeah, and I think this is something you mentioned in the very first episode of the show when she showed up, that she was kind of like a collector of stories and almost this sort of like pseudo academic hero figure, right? And I think that's what we're seeing here is she just has so much knowledge of the world, but they can end up off course by 50 miles in a ruin of a city that was lost thousands of years ago. And she's like, okay, here's the history, here's the ward I need, we're good to go.
Does that mean she's a bard, right? Isn't it there's the storyteller kind of bard that collects stories?
We will get our own very fun categorization wheel that we can play around with. We're just not quite that far into the series yet.
Yeah. Other than that, again, I think if this were a video game, just to continue our metaphor from last chapter, this is the side quest. Like, there's an encounter to overcome and to deal with the consequences of, and you get a little XP and then you move forward. With a big cliffhanger here that is not just that the Trollocs are approaching, but that they are acting unusually driven and that the Myrddraal seems to be forcing them to act that way. And the question is raised at the end of the chapter, but what's forcing the Myrddraal to act that out of character along the way? And so, that to me is, again, intriguing that within this world, we have these sinister forces, but when they are acting with new urgency, then the characters are saying, well, whatever's behind all of this is acting in a way that is, if not unexpected, then with unexpected speed and intensity.
Yeah, and I think I like that kind of metaphor of the side quest as a description of what's going on in Shadar Logoth here, because I think this is something that Robert Jordan actually does really effectively throughout all of his books. Is I think he knows that his books are long, and so he has a tendency to put kind of one or two kind of side questy action scene revelation big moment event about 300-400 pages into every one of his books. And I think it's a really effective way of kind of getting you perked back up before, we need some more character development, we need some world building to get wherever we're going next. I think he does a really good job of kind of doing that Marvel thing of like, oh look, here's a fight scene for those of your kids who are getting bored in the middle of their 2.5-hour movie.
Yeah, I agree with that as a solid tactic. I was laughing to myself because, again, the fantasy series I actually just wrapped up, the Dandelion Dynasty, the third book in the series, like so many of these, was written as meant to be the final volume, and then it got split into 2 books because it was so long. So the climax of this 1,000-page third book was essentially an episode of like Restaurant Wars or Top Chef. It was like a restaurant competition. And I was like, to myself, I'm like watching the pages. I'm like, I only got 100 pages left. Like the battle has to start now if it's happening. And it really was just a like, who has the best restaurant in this town? And it was enjoyable, and I'm not making fun, but it was like, oh, like I really need the battle. So I went immediately into the 4th book because I wanted to see the kind of throwdown to end all throwdowns. So yeah, and it's funny because I think, we're both academics. We like to act as smart as we can and put the chips on our shoulder when we have to. But I get bored just like anybody. And I
Yeah.
do need, that kind of breadcrumb trail to keep things interesting. As much as I might have criticized that, what I enjoyed across these two chapters, I would say most of all would be once the horns sound in the first chapter until they kind of have the confrontation, like that tension.
Yeah.
And then the tension of, obviously I know everything with this guy is wrong, but like, are the characters smart enough to figure out this is wrong and what are they going to do? So those kind of, you don't get that tension without some kind of action to pull people in and to put real stakes into it. And, again, you're hinting to me that maybe we've seen a fatal mistake here. So I'm excited to see what happens.
Yeah. And I think the one thing that I would say just going forward is that I think Shadar Lagoth is where we get to see a lot of moments where every character shows us who they are a little bit. And I think, to me, we've talked before about how the first half of this book is kind of not my favorite Wheel of Time. It's not quite there. We're now starting to get to the point for me where Matt feels a little bit more like Matt, and Perrin's going to start feeling a little more like Perrin, and Egwene's going to feel distinct. And that's what I really love about this series, is how kind of all the characters kind of blossom, and we're just starting to see those things peek through. So I really hope everyone is enjoying where we're at. I hope, that people are continuing to stick along. And let me tell you, we're getting to some of my favorite Wheel of Time in the next few chapters that we're going to be reading. So stick with it. I really hope that you're excited. One thing that I did want to mention, Greg, is that we recently had the poll about whether or not we would be doing just 2 chapters per week or extending a little bit longer. Last I had checked, it was basically a 50-50 split. Is that about where we ended up long run?
It is about where we ended up. I think I've heard a little bit that people, and you were, we're figuring this out as we go, and you were hearing that, or you were observing in our downloads that there is a lag, that, people aren't kind of hitting it week to week, which makes sense. And we try to keep this kind of timeless so that you can work through it at your own pace if you can't keep up week to week. So to me, I think that means since it's about 50-50, we'll use that lag to mean let's just keep it to maybe 2 chapters at a time. And that way, if it's a lighter week, we're helping those of you cramming the homework in at the last minute. So
I may be that student, or at least I was this week. So it's great that we got to hear from all of you. Please continue on Twitter or any other social media that jump in and continue talking. Let us know what's going right and let us know what's going wrong. Any last things you wanted to say, Greg?
I'll just echo that and say, if there's ever anything that we could do immediately or feedback you want to get to us, hit us on Twitter. The DMs, buzz my phone and I check them right away. A couple people have sent messages and I've gotten back to them. As we continue to learn about this, we have a presence on Instagram, but I realized quickly there's not a lot of pictures to post about this. You can only post the logo so many times, or pictures of my book next to a pastry of some kind so many times. So we'll continue to try to have a presence in different areas and let people know about the show. But if you have something urgent, then reach out that way and I'll be sure to get back to you. So next episode, we have 2 new chapters 20 and 21, which are Dust on the Wind and Listen to the Wind. Intriguing, taking those as a diptych, but you have already tipped your hand that they're not that related. So I'm excited. I continue to enjoy reading this a lot and to share this time with you. And that you is both Tylor, thank you very much, and our listener community. So until next time, we will look forward to seeing you through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.